Welcome to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth, and I'm here along with Michael Hepworth. Today, we are going to talk about some of the constitutional amendments dealing with the president. We had a number of constitutional amendments that addressed various items associated with the president. As you may know, the office of president was one of the more hotly contested um, offices or responsibilities during the Constitutional Convention. The founding fathers were very nervous about the president side of things. Um, and it's interesting to see that with the amendments, the president has had quite a few amendments dealing with the powers and addressing certain aspects of it. So today we are looking at a few constitutional amendments. We have the 20th Amendment, which deals with when the president and vice president take office. Also deals a little bit with when Congress assembles. So it's not just a president one. We have the 22nd Amendment, which deals with term limits for the president. Currently, the president is the only federal officer to have a term limit. We have the 23rd Amendment that allows the District of Columbia the ability to vote for president. And then the 24th Amendment that says that citizens of the United States can vote for president, vice president, or senator or representative in Congress, even if they don't pay their taxes. And they're also saying that there should be no poll tax in place that would deny someone the right to vote. And then with the 25th Amendment, we go into more details on what to do when a president dies or is removed from office and the type of succession that takes place. It also deals with issues related to the president's competency, where if the president is incompetent at the time they are serving, that there is a path for them to be removed from power, or at least they don't have power in the moment. So a number of amendments, some of them don't have a ton of substance to talk about. Some of them are more just fairly basic with what they're doing. But one that we wanted to focus on today was the one with term limits, and where it set the president to 2 term limits. We have Franklin D. Roosevelt that served, he was part of what they called the New Deal, where there was a lot of legislation in America that radically altered the scope, size, and role of the federal government. And there was a lot of more social type policies that came into being during this time. This was the Great Depression era in America, a time where there was certainly some concern for the economy, concern for Americans being able to make it. Things were bleak with the super high unemployment rate and the like. And FDR served 4 terms. And that became something that a lot of people were uncomfortable with, even though a lot of people elected him to serve 4 terms. So number-wise, I don't know for sure whether there was more uncomfortable with it, but they still voted for him. Whether the number of people uncomfortable with it was overstated, I don't fully know. But after the fact, they did decide, let's limit it back to what George Washington did. George Washington stepped down after 2 terms as president. And so we got the 22nd Amendment that said president gets to serve 2 terms, maybe part of a third if they were a vice president that succeeded a president. And today in America, I feel we hear a fair amount about term limits, and are they, some people want them, some people don't want them. Obviously, I think politicians don't love them in general. But and so I'd say we haven't seen a ton of movement on it necessarily. But I do know quite a few people that still talk about it. And so when we look at some of the pros and cons of term limits, I think it's helpful to see, just to take a look through, what do they do? What are reasons people want them? what are reasons people don't, and maybe what are some of the intended or unintended effects associated with these. So Michael, curious to know at the outset, if someone were to ask you some of the pros and cons associated with term limits, what are some of the things you would throw out there?
I'm always curious about numbers and such things. So the first thing that popped into my head was, well, if we had term limits, we might spend a whole lot more money on paying for retired Congress people, as once they've left office, we still provide uh, a lot of benefits to those who have served in offices in the government, be it president, be it congressperson. So held the 2 terms, and then we have to get more people in there. Well, we'll spend a lot more money on those kinds of things. So it'd be more expensive. I think you could, when you look at pros and cons of what would a term limit do, you say, well, if you get somebody in that's just doing terrible things, but they continue to get voted in, you could argue that, well, the people voted them in, they want them in there, so they can stay as long as the people want them. Sometimes at the federal level, your impact um, can be felt wider than just in the area you're being elected from. And so some might argue that if a certain group of senators, are causing issues across the whole United States, it'd be great if they weren't always in office. You could get a fresh set of eyes in there. But again, some people would say if you get somebody good, you want to keep them there. They're doing a lot of good things. Let them have at. Sometimes it feels that some members of Congress just stay in Congress and don't do a whole lot and just stay there for years and years and years. And you wonder if maybe they're more energetic if they're just working for 2 terms or 3 terms or something like that. There's a lot of kind of back and forth, a lot of different ways you could look at it, and try to decide if it's going to be effective or not. It's kind of hard to tell without actually seeing it play out. Most of the time, when you hear people talk about term limits, they generally point at individuals that have been in Congress for a while that they don't like. And so you'd have to then be willing to say, if I get somebody in Congress that I really like and they're doing a really good job, am I willing to let them go after however many terms you deem necessary, 2, 3, 4, whatever the case is. So just to keep that in mind, hey, if we're going to set term limits, it's across the board. It's not just for those people I don't like that seem to be there for a very long time. It could also be for people that maybe I do like. So, but if it's across the board, then you have people you don't like, people you do like, but they're all getting turned over every couple of terms. So maybe it all evens out in the end. A lot of ways to look at it. If we're looking at paying for things on a budget, well, let them stay in office as long as they can.
Yeah, at least make them work for their money.
Right.
It's a good point that if they're in there and then leave and then they're on a pension or whatever for a long time, that can be pricey. But it is interesting, when we talk about term limits, I do think people have some sense of understanding that something starts to happen when people are in a long time. Now, again, this something may be good or bad depending on what you think of the person and their power. But it seems that the longer they're in there, the more relationships they have, the more they can get done. They kind of become more powerful as they're in for a longer time. And we look at people like Orrin Hatch from Utah. He served a very long time in the Senate, and he was a very powerful figure. Basically, if he wanted something to happen, he could usually make it happen. And so he was key quite often to keeping Hill Air Force Base in Utah. At times when they would slate Air Force bases for closure. And so some people like that. They said, well, it's great. We kept the Air Force Base here. We have, money coming in the economy. We've got protection. We've got whatever. But it is interesting just to see, to your point, Michael, that these things can affect other people. And it meant that Air Force bases and other locations got closed. Now, was that good or bad? I don't know. Certainly for the local area, it was probably really bad to lose those. For the country as a whole, was it appropriate? No, possibly. Um, I Again, I haven't done the research on any of that. I'm not much to comment on it, but I think we start to get a little bit wary of people becoming more powerful than maybe the position was supposed to be. And so some people start talking about term limits. But certainly, to your point, if we're going to impose term limits, they'll be imposed on people we like and people we don't like. And where does that shake out? The interesting thing that it does is, we hear people talk about in today's world, talk about the deep state some, um, and they want to clean things up or get people out. Again, from that power perspective, people can believe that if you've been in office a long time, you're tied into something that maybe you shouldn't be. But on the flip side, if we kick everyone out every 2 terms, let's say, you can only serve for 2 terms and then you're done. The interesting thing of what that does is has the potential to say, well, there's a bunch of newbies in here and they don't really actually know what's going on. And so then you look to who are the people that know what's going on and those that can tell them what to do. And it gives, I think, a powerful nod to the administrative state because those unelected officials that sit right under the elected ones um, are there to run the government. And they become, I think, more powerful if you impose term limits because they can just say to the newbies, hey, this is how it is. This is what we do. This is the way it works. And they don't really know any different. There's not the institutional memory to say, no, actually, we can do this, or, it doesn't have to be that way. And so the federal government has grown so large that we have tons of unelected officials, tons of unelected people who run things. And in a lot of ways, those are the ones maybe that we should be looking at term limits on or years of service on or something to say, maybe we should have turnover there because we can't vote for those people. Maybe we don't want those people in for life when we can't even vote for them. And, some people say we actually have term limits in America. It's every 4 years or 2 years or 6 years, depending on what office you're running for, that your term comes up and you have to be voted in again. The pressure to be voted in again makes it so that the politician has to kind of try and align their actions to what the people want, because if they tick them off enough, they're not going to win their next election. If every politician knows they're getting kicked out of office at the end of that election, they could start to do quite a few things that the public really doesn't like, because then they know they're on their way out anyways. And we've seen that happen with presidents. We call it the lame duck time. Between the time of getting voted out, they still have a little bit of time left. And this is one of the things that the 20th Amendment sought to reduce. It used to be that the elections would happen in November, and then you had until March to replace them. So there was this period where the president could do quite a bit of things, this lame duck period. And the 20th Amendment shortened that to in January. Took a month and a half or so off of it to give the president less time to do damage when they knew they weren't being reelected. But again, with the 22nd Amendment then following, every second term, the president knows they're not being reelected. And they're no longer as accountable to the people because they're not concerned about getting reelected at that point. And so the term limit side is one that I think as people, we often say, oh, we need term limits because it helps us feel empowered that the senators and those can't continue to get away with things. They get flushed out, the system will get cleaner. But I don't know if it's necessarily guaranteed to make it any cleaner. And at the end of the day, we as a people can choose to clean things up. We don't have to leave them the way they are.
And I think that final piece is a really good point. You mentioned the deep state, discussions about that. But if you say that members of Congress can't remain in there for very long, that power, we don't talk about it a lot, but that power today actually exists a lot in the political parties themselves, in the Republican and Democratic parties. For example, I think you mentioned in previous video, Donald Trump was able to request the chair of the Republican Party, just kind of pick whoever he wanted to chair that. there's a lot of power vested in these parties, and if we say, hey, you have to leave office every 2 terms, is that going to change a lot when the next person in line is just whoever each one of these parties picks? We're not doing a lot in our country to kind of battle back against the power of these parties. In fact, in most instances, we're just supporting it. We say, yes, we want power vested in these parties because we believe they align with our values or they are going to help the country, whatever the case is. We send a lot of power to these parties, and so if we just say term limits for those in power, that doesn't necessarily change the type of individual that will then be elected next time around. Too often I hear, especially about the president, but very often it's, well, I have a choice between two people I don't really like. I'm going to choose the one I think is not as bad as the other one. And I don't know that term limits ever do anything to change that. You just have more times you have to try to decide between two people you don't like because their terms come up. So it could very easily be said, with all the power we vest in these political parties, that we may not actually make a difference by having term limits. We'll just put more people into office that do the same things as the ones we currently dislike because they're all kind of coming from the same place today. I don't know that we're doing a lot to change that.
Yeah, and to me, it's helpful to just look at, we do have term limits in one place, and that's on the president. And still, the president, ironically, is one of the choices in an election that we struggle with the most, that I hear the most complaining about in America, to say two horrible choices. Now, again, there are people that like both candidates this time around, but we have term limits on president. It didn't give us better picks for president necessarily. And so we do have this more fundamental issue to say, well, where are our candidates coming from? Who are the people behind that power? And that goes to the political party side of, how do people get through that system? What's taking place there? Here in Utah, it's interesting. There's an ongoing debate where the parties had a caucus system, and you would say, I want to run as a Republican or Democrat. And then anyone else running for the same position, you'd go to a convention where delegates that were appointed at caucuses would come and vote on you. So it wasn't everyone in Utah. Everyone in Utah could go to a caucus if they're registered for that party, and then elect a delegate to go represent them at these state conventions. These delegates then vote to determine who gets through. And if someone got 60% or more in convention of the delegate vote, they would be the Republican or Democrat nominee. If they didn't, then it would go to a primary where every registered Republican or Democrat could vote on them. Each party has slightly different rules. The Democrats, for example, allow anyone to vote. The Republicans restrict it to just Republicans here in Utah. But that system was changed where they said there's the convention route, but you could skip the convention route and go straight to a primary if you could gather a certain number of signatures from registered voters. And this produced a lot of conflict in Utah. A lot of people upset about it because they said, well, the political parties are primary. Sorry, I said primary. The political parties are private, and the government shouldn't be interfering with private rights of association. Let them do whatever they want. Let them pick their candidates. Don't give them the signature route to skip the convention, to skip the party, and go straight to the primary. And it's something that comes up quite a bit. It was litigated in court. The courts upheld it so far as constitutional. And people are really upset, saying it's a private thing, private right of association. We're Republican, we're Democrat. But I think that people do forget very quickly that Republicans and Democrats aren't entirely private. They're a party who have favors granted to them by law. They can place people on a ballot to vote on. And if we wanted to say, yeah, all private parties are equal, just, you want to create a Believe party or whatever you want to do, sure, come put your candidate on the ballot, come put your candidate on the ballot. You just tell us who it is. But it's not that way. The Republicans and Democrats have a lot of power, and there's not a national third party. And it's not because people don't want one. It's not because people haven't tried. It's because the parties have made it so difficult to form a national party that virtually no one can do it. And so they've used law to entrench themselves in as the only two places that can put up viable, strong candidates. Um, and I look at that as saying that's not entirely private. You're now a group that's manipulating law for your benefit. And this is the law that elects appointed officials. To me, it's kind of a quasi governmental relationship. And I'm not saying that I agree necessarily with Utah's solution of a signature gathering, but I went on this tangent a little bit to say, to Michael's point, we don't actually address, in my belief, the real issues. We say, oh, we need term limits. Well, have term limits improved our president choices at all? I don't think so. But have they cemented in the power of the parties that much more? Yeah, I think so. And when we go to, again, the power of the party or the power of the administrative state, all those unelected officials, when a new president comes in, who do they want to put in? They want to put in people who have similar values to them. A lot of those are probably going to be told to them by the party who to put in power, who to do, different things. Again, the groups are very closely tied. The administrative state, the party in power. And currently, when we're speaking about the president gets to appoint over 6,000 people during the term of their presidency based on how large the federal government's grown. It's huge. And appointing 6,000 people over the course of 4 years is a crazy remarkable feat. And most presidents now don't even get through all the appointments necessary. There's just too many. It takes too much time. But the president doesn't know all these people. The president doesn't know half of them from Adam or Eve. And they are just going on recommendations, or again, someone's telling them who to put in office. And maybe some of those figureheads again are kicked out or put in. But I look at it currently. I'm running for attorney general in Utah as an independent, and some people will ask me, say, "Well, do you have experience for this or experience for that?" And there's no person that runs for attorney general, in my opinion. I don't know of anyone, anyways, that has all the experience of what the attorney general's office does. The attorney general's office handles a ton of stuff. I think it's very good to ask about experience. I'm not opposed to that at all. But at the end of the day, the attorney general themselves, they don't go out and do most of the work. They're there to lead. They're there to put things in place. The government doesn't, we don't have qualifications really necessary for a lot of these positions, because the government's not actually being ran by most of these people. There's a whole system underneath them that comes in. If you go into the attorney general's office, there are heads of the office that run everything, and there's people under them. They've been there years and years and years. They know what's going on. And honestly, a lot of the same things take place regardless of who that figurehead is that's elected. And again, to me, this is just to go to the point of, if we want to look at where power centers sit and how to potentially put checks and balances on power centers, we need to be looking aggressively at the parties and the administrative state that exists underneath the level that we elect to office. Both of those are places that term limits aren't going to solve either one of those problems. And those are places that bring an intense number of issues with them. So again, a couple things to think about with term limits. Now, I'm not saying that term limits couldn't serve a purpose, but I think that it does beg the question though internally of, well, why do we keep voting for these people if they're no longer good? And just because I don't believe they're good, if they're being voted in, 50% of the voters believe they're good. So what is it? What's going on? And some of us, again, back to your point, Michael, will say, well, it's the lesser of two evils. Well, that then gets into, well, term limits aren't going to address that issue at all. That's into the more the political party side of things. And so to me, we want to look at more fundamental issues. We want to look at campaign finance laws, how they cement in the power of the parties. We want to look at the administrative state, the appointment side, look at checks and balances. So for example, should we have the ability to vote on retaining elected officials? In Utah, we have a system where state judges come up for vote every number of years to say, should we retain them? Utahns don't vote on the original appointment, but they can vote whether they want to retain the official or not. Now in Utah, I don't think people generally look too much into the judges. They generally just get a rubber stamp and get retained. And so even sometimes putting these powers in place means that we now have a new responsibility as people. And what are we going to do about it? I can kick out a bad judge in Utah, but I have to actually look at their track record and see what's going on. And it was very interesting to see Utah made a very concerted effort to give citizens information on judges, and they would take polls from attorneys that appeared in front of them, parties that appeared in front of them, ask about how they were treated, how fair they were, how the law was applied, different things. And there was a judge that this commission that would look at them looked at and said, whoa, it's so bad. This judge has done a really bad job. We can't even in good conscience recommend to Utah that they retain them. And the Judicial Evaluation Committee recommended to Utah voters that don't retain this judge. They're just not doing a good job. And Utah voters, that information was publicly available, and we still voted to retain that judge. And so when we talk about problems in government with things like term limits, I think we do need to look hard at ourselves and say, are we trying to place the blame somewhere else, or are we accepting responsibility and saying, I will go look and do my part to get the best candidate in place and to vote the best that we can? So I guess just saying, on our balance side of things that we like to talk about, we have the right to vote, which means we have the responsibility to be informed about what we're voting on. And if we're not going to exercise that responsibility, I don't know that any set of checks and balances can stop our own choices from being poor if we're not even willing to look at basic information available to us on the internet. And so here's a plug for the coming election to say, at a minimum, go look at the website of every candidate before you vote on them. At least do that. Just tell yourself, I have to at least have looked at their website to see what's there and what's not there. But Mike, I don't know if you have more thoughts on any of those things.
No, I just think back to our episode from last week where we talked about the women in Tennessee who, one of the reasons they weren't fighting for the vote, they're kind of fighting against it, is they said it was an obligation to vote. You had to learn, you had to educate, you had to be involved in the political side of things. And it's something we don't pay enough attention to. Reading a book by Louis L'Amour, and he had one of his characters say that, this is again back in the 1800s, but the character said that no man has the right to be ignorant. In a country like this, ignorance is a crime, meaning in America where there's just so much, and this is in the 1800s. The character in this book was picking up books from other people as he's riding around on trails, and he started reading things from Locke and Blackstone and things like that. But he says if a man is going to vote, he's going to take part in his country and its government, and it's up to him to understand. And so, yeah, I think there's a call for us to become aware of what's going on. It's not so much because, to your point of the size of the federal government, it can be really daunting. There's a lot of different topics out there. There's sound bites online that you can find from any number of politicians about any number of topics. And you go, well, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. How are you supposed to know enough about everything? But I think the point isn't to know everything about every topic, but it's to try to understand the principles of the individuals that are running, at least to some degree, and say, do I feel comfortable with that? Or when you look around at the principles of the candidates, you don't see anything you feel comfortable with. You say, well, what do we need to do about that so that we're getting individuals into office, or at least up for a vote, that seem to better represent our moral values. We have a responsibility there to understand something about the individuals that we're voting for.
Yeah. I love the quote from Louis L'Amour that you referenced. It is a very interesting concept to say, should it be a crime to be ignorant? We live in a world where we have so much available to us, and it's amazing how much we don't know about so many things. And obviously, a lot of that comes from, it's not just from the fact that we don't search or are lazy. There's also money powers and kind of greed type powers that are there trying to manipulate or coerce. And so there's bad information put out, there's false information put out. And it does take time and effort to sort through things. And I guess even just as a quick aside on that, if you're curious about how to find good information, one of the things to recognize is if the information is appealing to your anger or emotion and trying to make you upset or frustrated, they are probably trying to manipulate you and probably aren't disclosing everything associated with it. When sources intentionally try to seek to push anger in people, they're seeking to control. Anger is an easy way to control people, easy way to get them riled up where they'll look past a lot of facts and a lot of things. And I see quite often, facts thrown around. So just as an example with President, I saw one on social media where people were putting down President Biden. It showed a picture of him stumbling on the stage. And then they said, look, under Biden, things haven't been great. Look at all the stores that have closed in America. And they had a pretty long list of corporations, bigger corporations and names you'd recognize that had closed stores in America. But again, when I looked at it, I didn't feel that it was a fully honest thing. One, it was taking an image, Biden tripping on a stage, having nothing to do with economic policy and associating the two. But then, two, it said, for example, that there were 1,000 Dollar Trees that were closing. And that's true. Dollar Tree's closing a lot of stores. But they didn't note that Dollar General, I think it is, and I could have the exact names wrong. So one of these Dollar Tree stores or all the dollar stores are closing 1,000. But its competitors has opened something like 4,000 stores, and the competitors just destroying them. They're doing way better. And so there's nothing to say that the dollar store industry as a whole is failing in America. It's just in the realm of competition, one of the stores hasn't stayed competitive. The other one's ultra competitive and has really rolled out a ton of new stores. Sears was on that list as well. And they noted that Sears closed all but, I don't know, some few stores across the country. Sears used to be a powerhouse. But the Sears downfall started long before Biden was in office. They've been falling apart for years and years and years. And so again, to me, it's interesting to look at things like that and go, okay, yeah, you can gather little tidbits of fact, but when people present facts like that and they're very distorted, it instantly, to me, is a way to say, this isn't a super trustworthy source. They're trying to make me think something particular, trying to get an end result out of me. They're not there to share information for information's sake. And so again, just look at little things like that. What does a picture of Biden falling down have to do with economic policy? Nothing. It's just inferring and making inferences that they can then use to push whatever agenda they have. And so, or if I listen to certain talk radio show hosts or other figureheads, quite a few of them are really pushing an anger agenda. And from my perspective, anger is an emotion that always lies. When we're angry, we're missing something. It's based in, there's some element of things that aren't true, generally when we're angry, and we don't see a piece of it. And so if we want truth, we have to search in sources where they're not pushing anger, they're not feeding anger, they're not fomenting anger, and make sure that we can look at things and evaluate. Even if we don't like the current president and we don't like his economic policy, can we be honest and say, yeah, but it wasn't his policy that closed the $1,000 Dollar Tree stores. Those are pieces that, to me, if we want to be informed in America, we have to be able to just look at objectively. Did a candidate we don't like do something good? Probably. There's probably something good they've done somewhere. If we can't see that and we can't acknowledge good when good exists, we ourselves are part of that problem. We're never going to get correct information because we won't search for it. And so we have to recognize two things of searching for good information. One, are we searching to truly understand, or are we searching just to confirm an agenda? And two, are we consuming information that's pushing an agenda, or are we looking for information that's telling us a fair assessment of facts? And so again, that's an aside, a little bit of a tangent for today. But to me, it's very important to recognize that we have the power to look for good information. We need to use it. When we have a right to vote, we have a responsibility to be informed. If we don't want to be informed, I don't believe any set of checks and balances will save us from that. Is how that goes. But so that's kind of a rundown on the 22nd Amendment term limits. Let's go to the 20th Amendment real quick. Mike, you want to give a quick summary of the 20th Amendment?
Yeah, for sure. 20th was referencing when the terms of president and vice president will end, and the senators and reps as well. There was initially there was some difference about between the time when they were elected to the time that they started participating in either Congress or in their duties. And I think what if you read kind of the synopsis of why this amendment was put in place, I think they believe initially that due to technology and travel constraints, it made sense to have an election and then wait a fairly substantial period of time before an individual who was elected would begin their duties. They had to take care of travel. You had to make sure you could publish information about elections across the country, and all those things took time. As obviously as technology improved, especially if you look at it today, news became more instantaneous very quickly, very early on in American history. The travel times reduced considerably. And so they said it doesn't really make sense to wait, and the waiting kind of has a negative connotation to it in that in a circumstance where a president doesn't receive a majority of the electoral votes, the vote is generally turned over to the let me get this right here. Sorry, House of Reps. Oh, I almost said the Senate. Turned over to the House of Reps, and they vote on the president at that point. With the delay in the ending of terms and the beginning of new terms for newly elected reps, what would happen under a circumstance like that is a president that was not elected by the people, didn't receive majority votes, would go to the House of Reps that was filled with representatives that may or may not have just been voted out by the people, meaning they have voted somebody new to come in to take the place of somebody who's already in the House of Representatives. So your next 4 years of president could potentially be chosen by a group of individuals that would not be participating, had just been voted out by the voice of the people, and they were voting somebody else in. So they wanted to kind of clear that up so that the ongoing president would be chosen by representatives that also were chosen at the same time, not ones that had been voted out. They were also a little concerned that the session of Congress that took place around that time was shorter because of how much longer it was taking for representatives to begin their work. And they didn't feel that they could address all the needs that they should in a short session of Congress. And so they said, hey, we need these start dates and end dates to be in January so we can have full sessions of Congress, so we can make sure that if the House of Representatives has to vote on a president, it is the new set of representatives that have been voted in and not an old set that have been voted out. I think that kind of summarizes it to some degree.
Yeah, and again, I think it's just good to note that founders never were fully at peace with the president's side of things. And I think some of these amendments we see some of the nuances working themselves out where we start to have these things come into play. Um, we get to the 23rd Amendment, which is pretty short, but it gives the people in the District of Columbia the right to have some electoral votes for president. And so I guess there was kind of a feeling that those that work for the federal government and work for the president maybe should have a say in that if they're living in the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is not currently a state, technically. Um, it's under the control of Congress. And so they did, though, give it the ability to vote for president and vice president with the 23rd Amendment. Now, we do see this play coming in. Some people want to make District of Columbia a state because then it would have the ability to appoint senators and representatives. Some people would like Puerto Rico to be a state, for example, to do the same thing. That could start to shift the balance of power between, in a Senate that's almost 50-50 currently between the two parties. You get District of Columbia in there, tends to be more Democrat leaning. And so there would then be an additional 2 senators. And so, again, some of the interesting things to look at, some of the nuances. Now, in America, it's been a few years since we had a state admitted, but for a long time in America's history, we had a decent ongoing stream of states we'd admit to the union. And so we do have the question of, well, when, how, where, why should we admit new states if we do? Should Puerto Rico be a state that's treated as U.S. territory? Should something like Guam be a state? It's kind of like Hawaii, but it's treated as U.S. territory with military bases there. But they don't have statehood, don't have full voting rights. And District of Columbia is the same. They don't have full voting rights. And so these are pieces that will continue to play out. And again, I know in my lifetime there hasn't been a new state admitted, so it feels very foreign. But looking at history, it happened a lot. From 13 to 50, and we went up 37 states over the course of a little under 200 years. And so it'll be interesting, I think, to see how that plays out. But going on to the 24th Amendment, we have the states becoming concerned about poll taxes. Poll taxes became a way to try and keep certain groups of people from voting. Sometimes they were seen as being fairly race discriminatory in nature by saying they had to pay a certain amount in order to vote. And so it kind of could make it so that it was more of a white man privilege at the time, or a rich person privilege. But in general, wealth was following classes in some of these states or races. Certainly, though, there would have been more white people who would have not been able to vote with a poll tax. But in general, it had a lot bigger impact on different groups. And so 24th Amendment comes along and we say, let's abolish the poll tax. Now, I don't hear a lot of dispute over this today. I don't hear a lot of people saying we should be able to institute a tax to vote. There are people that want to require a driver's license to vote to be able to prove identity to help with verification. But from the tax side, they're not necessarily looking at that. However, I would just throw out, we have publicly traded companies in America that exercise quite a bit of power. They're kind of becoming their own power centers in and of themselves. And companies like Google, Facebook, these others, when they're publicly traded, people with enough money can buy in and own shares. And those with more money can vote and exercise more control and power over these companies. And it's interesting to see that in some ways we abolished a poll tax, but in other ways there's still this thing about, well, if you're rich, you can vote from the perspective of Wall Street or big business. Big business does impact regulation, does impact government. Now, do they control it fully? No. There are definitely times that the big businesses get slapped down and pushed back on by the government. but they do act as a check or a balance on the government. The government acts as a check and balance there. But in those realms, we still have the requirement that you buy in, you pay to play essentially to run in that realm. And I think it'll be interesting to see over time how America tries to strike the balance with regulating big business versus, exactly just how that plays out. To me, there's a big difference between a truly private business that's held by a handful of people versus one that's publicly traded and just owned by whatever member of the public has money to buy stock. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we start to see delineations and regulations start to pop in where we realize there needs to be a check here. Kind of like it took us years to check the poll tax and balance it. I think we'll eventually get more and more checks on big business that come into play. But some of those may follow publicly traded businesses, some of them may not. But to me, it's just a interesting point to throw out with poll taxes, is that we didn't like the notion that you had to pay to play for access to the government. And then the 25th Amendment allows, it just confirms the vice president takes over if the president can't act. And then it also talks about this interesting thing, since this is an issue in the election today between Biden and Trump, both sides allege that the other is unfit for office, they're not competent. Well, Amendment 25, Section 4 actually has a provision to deal with incompetency of the president and the vice president and a majority of the principal officers of the executive departments can tell the Senate and the House that the president is unfit for office or unable to discharge the powers and duties of office. If that happens, the vice president takes in as the acting president. The president can send a letter back saying, no inability exists, and then the president shall remain in power unless the vice president and majority of these principal officers of the executive department send a letter back and say, actually, we dispute that. At that point, Congress gets to decide the issue, whether the president's able to do their duties or not. So Congress, though, can also pass a law and make it someone else besides the majority of the principal officers of the executive department. They could, for example, say majority of Congress and the vice president says the president's unfit for office. Now, one thing to know about this is this wouldn't switch it from a Democrat to a Republican or a Republican to a Democrat. It would just put the vice president in office. But there still is a provision here that talks about what happens in that scenario. And I think that America, by experience, realized, we've got a couple of these things to clean up. The office of president is pretty important. And there were a fair number of amendments passed to the Constitution dealing with the president and the election of the president. Michael, do you have any final thoughts or comments on any of these amendments that we've talked about today?
Just that it's interesting to see the kind of evolution as we encounter problems, the steps we take to try to maybe mitigate future problems or just try to better clarify the way we would like things to function. Most of these amendments are kind of administrative in nature. Maybe they don't seem too interesting, but I think it's neat to see the way we try to address these issues via amendment. I think it's important to realize these aren't, world-changing amendments here, and that seems appropriate that we kind of take it in bite-sized chunks. Let's address this piece. Let's address this piece. Let's try to provide a little more clarity around this. It seems an appropriate way to handle questions, to handle concerns, take them a little bit at a time, see how it plays out, take some more. So it was kind of neat to go through these and just kind of watch that process.
Yeah, and on that note, it's a good point because sometimes we want huge amendments that change a lot of things. And those are very contentious and very hard to get through. But if we focus on fixing little things, we can start to chip away at bigger things and bigger issues. And like you say with the amendment process, maybe it's best that it is through the smaller, simpler means that these things happen. Because we're not trying to rock the whole foundation. We're trying to fix problems that may arise or place checks and balances in place. And so as we talk about potential solutions to issues, sometimes it's very good to start and say, well, what can we do today? What can everyone agree on today? Let's at least get that in place, move on to the next thing, and tackle them in bite-sized chunks rather than demanding that we have all the answers and fix everything overnight. But ultimately, I think these amendments also show that America is quite resilient. It survived all the issues that raised these amendments. It is continuing forward. And I do believe strongly that even though people may not like the choices for president, if you look at it, America has survived 4 years under each president that we currently have choices for, at least out of the two parties. There's other third parties and independents. And America's still going. And I believe very strongly America will still be going after the next election, after 4 years is up. Because there is a lot in place that places checks and balances, and there's a lot that can't just be overthrown or undone. Unless perhaps we as a people give it up. We could certainly walk away from it, I guess, if we wanted, but so many people in America are still so invested in America as a country. And it's provided us a great way of life. It's provided us with so many things that I believe very strongly we'll continue to hold on to it. And that these amendments represent, corrections, but also kind of the hope of America that we do try and address issues, we do try and fix them. Some things may be contentious, some things may take time, but we continue to advocate and push for what we believe is right. And that process creates improvements over time. So thanks for joining us today. We will follow up next week. We're coming close to finishing the constitutional amendments portion of things, and we appreciate you joining us. We will talk to you later.